This is a re-recording of the PowerPoint presentation made as part of Responsible Tourism in Destinations 16 in the Gambia in January 2024. It's really looking at the application of Porter's work on creating shared value in a number of different initiatives in Africa and Asia. The recording is made to enable people who are at the conference to hear it again and look at it more slowly with the slides, but also to make it available to others who may be interested in the value of Porter's work on creating shared value around tourism. The fundamental argument is that by creating shared value for the benefit of tourism, it creates both a richer experience for the tourist and increases length of stay, and at the same time enriches the local community by growing the local economy. So during the presentation we looked at three things. We looked at responsible tourism as a way of making better places for people to live in. We went on the following day to look at some of the core tenets of responsible tourism. The fundamental point is that without people taking responsibility, there can be no sustainable development. We need to make it happen. We make it happen by taking responsibility to make change in the way that it delivers. So there is a difference between sustainable and responsible. Sustainable tourism and responsible tourism are at all the same thing. Responsible tourism is about taking responsibility for achieving sustainable development through tourism. The responsible bit is the active bit that makes the objective of achieving sustainable development possible. So that responsible tourism is about what you do individually and collectively to make tourism better in the destination. The Millennium Development Goals in 2015 became the Sustainable Development Goals, which are being reported against 231 unique indicators, and we'll see the outcome of these processes in 2030. The difficulty with the goals is that there are so many of them, and really for responsible tourism it's important to focus on the particular things that you can do in a given business or destination to make a difference and to achieve the objectives that you clearly state, along with to measure the ways in which you have made those changes and what you've achieved. So there's a lot of material available on the Responsible Tourism Partnership, and that's where you would have found this recording. I would suggest to you that there is other material there which you may also find interesting. So what is the business case for responsible tourism? I'm often asked that question. In reality, I don't think there is a business case. It's not singular. There are multiple cases for why responsible tourism makes business sense. The first, and we should never forget this, the first is simply that it's the right thing to do. The managers, owners, boards of directors of tourism businesses all have a sense of some degree of responsibility for the way they leave the planet for subsequent generations. And I've many times been told by main board directors that they began to understand what was meant by this because of a conversation they'd had either with one of their own children or one of their grandchildren, or perhaps someone else's. But there's a sense in which it's the right thing to do. It's also about minimizing risk, partly because the ability to operate a tourism business turns upon having a license to operate, turns on being accepted by the local community as something which is of value to the community, something which contributes to local livelihoods, not just something which exploits the local environment and the local community. It can be about product quality. that fresh food sourced locally is often of higher quality than food brought into the area from outside. It can be about better quality craft, better quality tourism experiences, better quality activity, better quality guided activities. It can also be about cost and carbon savings if you're not having to import the goods that you require, the produce in particular, that you require to operate your business. And in staff morale, it's clearly very advantageous if the staff turnover is low, because the investment cost in training staff is high. If you have high staff turnover, the quality of the service, the quality of the product declines. Whereas if the community feels that the work is valuable to the community in some broader sense, staff morale tends to be lower. Now, when people talk about the business case for responsible tourism, they often just talk about the market advantage. And I'm not going to deny that there is a market advantage. It provides richer experiences, more authentic, guilt-free experiences, and it differentiates the responsible, greener, more sustainable business from others. The point I want to make is it's not merely about market advantage. There are some product advantages and there's some community advantages which lead straight into Porter's work on creating shared value. So Porter, probably most famous for his work on cluster theory, publishes out of the Harvard Business School. He's very clear about what shared value is not. It's not about social responsibility. It's not about philanthropy. It's not just about sustainability. He says it's rather a new way to achieve economic success, where businesses act as businesses, not as charitable donors. And the point he's making is that companies have, to a large extent, overlooked the well-being of their customers when they think about what they produce. The depletion of the natural resources, which are vital to businesses, they tend to overlook that. They've not been sufficiently concerned with the viability of key suppliers, and they've not thought sufficiently about the economic distress of the communities in which they produce and sell. The consequence of that is that they undermine their own sustainability. The purpose then, this is Michael Porter saying it, the purpose of the corporation must be redefined as creating shared value, not just profit per se. This will drive the next wave of innovation and productivity growth in the global economy. Now that is a significant but not completely life-changing difference in the way he sees a corporation to the way that they were seen 20 or 30 years ago. You can see in Porter's work that his work on cluster theory and the fact that successful businesses needed other businesses around them in their supply chain, there's a natural connection between that and his much more recent work on creating shared value. Now, alongside the theorization that Porter is involved in as a very senior and serious academic, we need to recognize that the market is changing. Now, this presentation was made in the Gambia. Perhaps the biggest single change there has been the growth of diaspora tourism. People born in the Gambia who've moved abroad and had often very successful careers coming back to holiday, to spend time with their families, and also to build properties. European tourists who've been a long-term stalwart of Gambian tourism, those European tourists are often now an aging population, but they have a very high level of repeat visits, and we'll come back to that. Traditionally, in the Gambia particularly, they've come on inclusive packages on charter airlines, primarily from Europe. But that market is declining. We are seeing a growth in independent travellers, people booking their own flight and accommodation. And of course, that's in part generated by people buying second homes in the Gambia, there's a lot of encouragement for that at the moment. People buying second homes and the diaspora themselves buying properties and then letting them through Airbnb and other platforms, with the revenues going straight into their London or New York bank accounts, possibly not even passing through the Gambia in the process. We'll look shortly again at repeat visitors, but the rates for the Gambia are very high. And of course, the easiest marketing there is referrals, either people repeating or recommending to their friends that they come back. And the bird watchers are very keen on the Gambia precisely because they're able to see a wide variety of birds in a relatively short physical distance. And also because the bird watchers who have had a good experience in the Gambia go home and in those cold winter days, stuck in a bird hide, get talking with other people there about their trips to the Gambia, and then refer possible visitors to the bird guide with whom they've travelled. More generally, we're seeing a transition in travel and tourism from a focus on value for money to experience for money, and the activity and the experience matter more and more to people. Now, before we move on, a brief word about all-inclusives. This is a list of pros and cons, which I took from a website called The Full Passport. They're beautiful, but the food isn't great. It's cost effective, but they may lack authenticity. It's a low stress vacation, but not a great adventure for adventure travelers or people who don't drink. It's great for families and groups, can potentially have significantly negative impacts on the local community. We need just to be aware that in an environment where living standards in Europe are stressed or falling across most of the continent, people are going to look for more secure holidays where they're not at risk of spending more than they intended to do so. I don't think we're anywhere close to seeing the end of the all-inclusive. We may in fact be going to see a significant growth in all-inclusives again because of falling living standards in the source markets. Nor do I think that we should just assume that all-inclusives are bad. When Adama and Abbar and I were working with the Bumsters and asking what their aspiration was, many of them saw getting employment in one of the hotels or resorts to be what they were looking for, because that would give them a secure income through employment in a way that working perhaps for a bar on the Senegambia Strip didn't offer them that kind of security. The question is not whether all-inclusives are good or bad. The question should be what kind of all-inclusive is good and how can we generate more of those. I think that's where the focus will be in the Gambia going forward, but that will apply in many other destinations as well. So to achieve sales, for the community to achieve sales, they need to have both a market-ready product and market access. So that investing in the value chains and the market linkages is at least as important as the more tangible investments like the building of accommodation and bars and restaurants and cafes. There also needs to be ongoing maintenance if the market-ready products are going to continue to be saleable in the marketplace. The market moves all the time, more quickly at some times, more slowly at others, but it is changing, and communities and SMMEs need to be given the skills to evolve their product in relation to the market if the product is going to remain market ready. So that requires a mentoring and partnership approach between the lead businesses and the community's SMME. This lecture is not about the failures of community-based tourism, but research that I and others have done demonstrates that community-based tourism sadly rarely works. We'll come back to this shortly. What we're talking about here, though, really is SMMEs based in communities, not the traditional community-based tourism, but SMMEs doing business with a market-ready product and securing market access in a range of different ways. So this is an example from South Africa. This is Transfrontier Parks Destinations. They have a lodge in the Kalahari. It's a close lodge. It was provided for them as part of a land resettlement, but without a relationship with a commercial operator, they would not be able to ensure that the product was market ready, that they could sell that product, provide the transport, the food, all the other elements which are involved in providing a lodge style accommodation in the middle of the desert. What's interesting is that by working with the Kamani San, they've been able to generate 2 million rand for them through developing their skills in crafting, and the income associated from being linked and the market access to the Transfrontier Parks destination Klaus Lodge has raised for them an income in excess of 2 million rand. This is another example. This is the Songo salt harvesters at Bellini. There used only to be 5 women, continuing the traditional practice of securing salt from a spring, a hot spring. They now are selling that Bellini salt because of the connection with tourism into the gourmet upmarket salt market internationally, and it also attracts tourists to see them visit and participate in the harvesting. They've made around 100,000 rand out of that form of shared value. And then at Blueberg, Intrepid, UK-based tour operator, global tour operator, wanted to a camping site with community interaction in Blueberg. That's made about 0.5 million, half a million turnover already for the community of Blueberg. That's just 4 examples of what can be done. What's on the screen now is Bitsys Hook Mountain Lodge, one of TFPD's properties, with the trading by TFPD between 2011 and 2022. You can see the turnover figures, the profit and loss. What is far more interesting from our point of view is the job creation and employment in the lodge, but look at the local procurement. Now, local origin is those things which are produced and sourced locally. Local supply is those things purchased locally, but not necessarily sourced locally. And you can see just by adapting your bookkeeping system to record that information, you can begin to get some reliable figures on the amount that's been spent in local origin and local supply. You can also look at the community benefit in terms of staff remuneration, pay and benefits, the rental paid to the community for the use of the lodge by the operator, and then the investment in the asset in terms of upgrading, maintenance and insurance. And then of course you can use the same figures to look at the regional economic benefit in terms of local procurement and community benefit. And the graphs beneath show what that's likely to mean. You can see in the graph on the right that the local benefit in terms of the asset upgrade, maintenance and insurance is much higher in the first few years of operation. As the property becomes more mature, then the largest gain is in staff remuneration and benefits. At the heart of the idea of responsible tourism is being clear about what you're doing. Sorry, at the heart of it is the idea of being clear about why you're doing, in which case this was to create local economic benefit and shared value, about what you've done, and about what those benefits are. And I think what this example from Witzenhoek Mountain Lodge demonstrates is that it's a relatively easy matter to produce reliable figures on the shared value created by a particular lodge or tourism business. Let's go briefly to Village Ways in India. The issue there was that in Binsar, in the foothills of the Himalayas, there was increasing concern about the depopulation of these very beautiful remote villages as young people moved away in pursuit of economic opportunity, but also in pursuit of connections with the outside world, which so often young people want. So there's a real need to reinforce the local economy. What Village Ways has done, therefore, is to create walking tours. These are not hiking tours, these are walking tours where you progress relatively slowly on a walk through the rural countryside in and around Binsar with a local guide and stay in accommodation owned in the village by the local community. This creates opportunities for young people and has significantly reduced out migration, which was the primary object of this particular effort to create shared value. So Village Ways is a tour operating business with a capacity to loan assets to communities, to build community lodges and to create the employment and upskill the local community to be able to maintain a tourism lodge for people walking from village to village through that part of the Himalaya. So then perhaps inevitably we come to focus mainly on the Gambia. ASSET was the Association of Small Scale Enterprises in Tourism. Asma Bar and Jerry played a major part in creating that organisation, designed to support local organisations by providing assistance with marketing, promotion, training and product development. Now, sadly, that organisation no longer survives. It didn't survive COVID, but it is important to recognise that without ASSET, it's unlikely that the initiative would have been as successful as it undoubtedly was. So ASSET was set up to assist and support small-scale enterprises in tourism to trade fairly, to pursue sustainable development. And to do that, it was clearly important to improve the product and to provide assistance with product development, marketing, training, quality control, and access to finance, all essential to the development of effective SMMEs and the creation of shared value. They were committed to work collaboratively and to promote networking and joint activities between members. They used partnerships and they sought to protect small-scale business interests, SMMEs, in the mass tourism industry. And they were, as long as they existed, fairly successful in doing that. The membership was of small scale and responsible enterprises. You can see the range of people who joined it, and the logo of ASSET was a mango, much used in the Gambia to sustain communities through the off season of tourism. And the mangoes are prolific, and of course the mango is an evergreen tree producing a very nutritious fruit. Was funded by a Department of International Development, British Government Challenge Fund project. And the process was absolutely simple at one level. We began by collecting information and sharing it to identify both examples of good practice and the barriers to access. We then, of course, had to research the market, which meant both researching the views of tourists and each of the sectors. So we found there's quite a lot of conflict between different groups within the informal sector and between the informal sector and the formal sector. So we then ran stakeholder workshops with each group to tell them what their potential market said about them. And then we used multi-stakeholder workshops to identify an agenda to address the issues which concerned each group. And finally came up with an agreed implementation agenda for change. That worked very well in terms of not arriving with clear views about what was wrong, but actually asking the important stakeholders in that process what the problems were, what needed to change, and then to work with each group of producers to work out how they needed to change and how they could make those changes in order to prosper from tourism. So the first phase was to build a multi-stakeholder consensus based on research, sharing objective information, assisting each group to respond and prepare an agenda for change, and then to agree the agenda and commit to implementation, which was then the second stage of the initiative. And that was followed by the third stage, which was monitoring and reporting on progress. We were very concerned to be able to demonstrate that we had created shared value, that we had improved the livelihoods of those members of the local community engaging in tourism. And I'll show you some figures shortly that demonstrate that. So in terms of good practice amongst the tour operators, they were providing information on some of the informal sector services. They were recommending some. Craft markets were recommended by all of the tour operators in their welcome visits. Over 80% recommended the license guides and the taxis. And they encouraged people to go off and meet local people through visits to the markets and the beaches. For hotels, local sourcing of fruit and vegetables, some meat and furnishing fabrics, and using women was in particular importance. What was really dramatic, though, was the difference in the earnings of the craft workers, particularly on free market days when the craft vendors or the juice pressers were able to sell within the hotel. On those days, their incomes really dramatically improved. In terms of local sourcing, there's a list there of the kinds of things. Interestingly, the informal sector were not selling to each other, and very few of them were selling to hotels or restaurants. Largely, the SMMEs were selling directly into the tourists, directly to the tourists, or being employed as labour in the industry. They were not, in the main, selling their product to the hotels or the tour operators. I don't want to go through all of this with you, but these are the issues which were identified in the craft market as their problems. Too much hassle, both inside and outside the market. They recognised they needed to reduce that level of hassle. And one Gambia tour operator was already thinking of stopping going to the Senegambia craft market because the hassle was too great. Product development and presentation recognised as a problem. Too much strong bargaining by the tourists, partly because in the market they had large piles of finished product, largely undifferentiated from what was on the next stall. So they were essentially, they'd reduced themselves to selling cans of beans and competing with each other only on price. So we reckon that there was a real need for more training for presentations and ways of convincing the incoming tourists to buy. Fruit stalls were beginning to diversify. They were doing hair plating and massage. but you can see that they're only made a profit in about 4 weeks of the peak season. So very unsatisfactory. The craft markets, you can see the index of quality is not great, nothing over 4. So there's a problem there across the full range. What was most telling, though, was that 95% of our respondents in the craft market said the market was getting worse. 80% of them didn't want their children to work in the market. And 75, that's 3/4 of them, 75% said they were using less assistance than they were 2 years ago. Too much competition, tourists bargaining too aggressively, the bumpsters putting people off, and the official guides therefore choosing to take their clients elsewhere. It's a pretty sorry state of affairs in the craft market. Then we looked at licensed guides, and again, one of the problems there was competition between the licensed guides. Again, a need for in-service and new guide training, more work on languages, the fact that the conflicts between the guides and the tourist taxis would on occasion spill over into fisticuffs. Lots of problems faced by the licensed guides. Satisfaction with the bird guides. The Department of Parks and Wildlife Management did a survey, it wasn't ours, which suggested that 80% of those who used the bird watching guides regarded them as good or excellent. It didn't make much difference whether they were guides employed by the tour operators or official freelance guides. They were rated more or less equally. 40% of the unofficial freelance guides were rated unacceptable or unsatisfactory. So working to improve the bird guides is an important priority in the Gambia, particularly given that they sell direct in terms of their own services to tourists who've made their own travel arrangements and their accommodation through the mainstream industry, but then hire a local guide to take them to see the birds, as it were, directly with that local bird guide. Then comes the bumpsters. Now, the bumpsters are people who talk to tourists. They are without other forms of support. We worked with them to create a more formal structure for the local guides, with a guide station where people could go and take a guide from a roster, so that there wasn't excessive competition, and to set fixed prices for particular guided tours. That worked very well for the licensed guides, and the bumpsters have become a bit less of a problem as a consequence of that. So, code of conduct agreed between the members of each of the sectors, and they're listed there, but also agreements about the way one group of SMME providers would interact with the others to try and reduce the level of hassling of tourists, but also the levels of conflict between the different groups of SMMEs. Self-regulation was critical to the whole thing. I mean, there you can see what the members of the Senegambia craft market did to invite tourists and to make the declaration that their visit would be hassle-free. The agreement was, if somebody was accused of hassling and warned once, they had one more, as it were, they were allowed one more offence, after which they would be banned from the market, and that would be backed up by the Gambian Tourism Authority at that time. Similarly, the guides have rotas and complaint systems which have improved guiding and reduced hassle in the Gambia. This has largely not survived, but this was the providing information in hotels for the informal sector. And again, it's about avoiding being ghettoized. It's about securing market access. And one of the ways of doing that was to have these what's on locally notice boards in the hotel lobbies. The official guides, they had guide office stations where you could go and collect a guide for a fixed price. Incomes increased as a result of this by a third between 2001 and 2002. Juice presses, there, with self-regulation overseen by the GTA, the Gambian Tourism Authority, badging, fixed pricing and no hassles, income more than doubled between 2001 and 2002. Jodi Beach fruit sellers, their income has increased by between 50 and 60%. So they had some rather nice stalls to sell from behind. The competition became about the way the fruit was displayed rather than about the price. So what did we learn? We learned that dialogue and shared understanding of problems is essential to any kind of multi-stakeholder action. That dialogue and open reporting both assist in overcoming suspicions. And that licensing, regulation, badging, and where necessary insurance, supported by training, are important mechanisms for legitimising the informal sector in the SMMEs. None of this is rocket science, but it does require a serious effort to apply these lessons learned to the informal sector. We saw great progress in the craft markets, particularly at that time, in reduced hassle, but also in product differentiation. So we can see here that we're getting dolls dressed up in Gambian clothing. The one at the top is a Gambian dress for a Barbie doll. And the one below is a Gambian dress for Barbie as well. So interesting changes in the product and the realization that mostly grandparents visiting the Gambia would be interested in buying these things for their children, and the sales went well. Free market days, really important. More use by hotel guests, a threefold increase in revenues at Coatue Beach, 43 new jobs, and at Senegambia incomes doubled as a consequence of the free market days. And if you look at the success, this was based on survey research in the departure lounge, you can see that 30% of the tourists were leaving having spent all of their spending money before they left. And really the Gambian informal sector was very successful at selling to British tourists, thus meaning that the money was captured in the Gambia rather than taken home by the tourists. So here's a sort of brief statement of the development impacts as we reported them to DFID. Fruit sellers up 50 to 60%, juice pressers up 120%, guides up 18 to 30%, the Coatue craft market up 300%, 343 new jobs, and 60,000 British tourists spending on average £8.30 a day in the informal sector, amounting to about £5 million a year. These are significant increases in revenues for local communities. Same information really presented in a different way. So the other lessons learned, really important that ASSET was there to provide a forum for the SMMEs, to establish cooperation between the different informal sector groups, to develop the codes of conduct and resolve conflicts. Identifying and sharing good practice was a very important part of the process, and differentiating those who are following good practice from those who are not, as well as enabling the SMMEs to engage with the mainstream mass tourism. So that was the initial DFID project on securing access for the informal sector in the Gambia. Adam Abbar then went on to do another project with agricultural producers in the Gambia. This is the marketing of the development nursery where the experiments underwent with to create to understand how best to grow the kinds of fruit and vegetables that the hotels wanted. Because one of the problems is always that the demands of the tourists and the resorts and hotels may be different to what subsistence farmers traditionally produce for their own use. So Gambia Good arrived in 2004, supported by Haygrove, a UK-based horticultural businesses. This funded by the Business Linkages Challenge Fund. And it's described simply a pro-poor smallholder horticultural marketing company that will provide tangible economic and social benefits to poor rural Gambian communities by linking them to the main tourism industry. I was not involved with this particular project, so it's easy for me to say it, not be accused of bragging. But what Adama achieved with this was extraordinary in its success. They realized very quickly that the problem in selling fruit and vegetables into the hotels was not that marketing was not the only problem. A big part of the problem was production capacity, and that in terms of the quality, the range, the fact that there were periods of intense scarcity and high prices, and other periods when there was very little demand from the hotels because of the seasonality of tourists, and the hotels were unwilling to compromise on quality or price in favour of fair trade. In other words, it needed to be done on business lines. The farmers needed to be producing at a price which could compete with the import of fruit and vegetables from Senegal. So in 2005, the thing was established. The main market was basically plugging gaps in the local supply chain for the hotels and resorts. Lots of pilot production, a slow and gradual replacement of imports, demonstrable sustainable practices, and they strengthened the links with the tourism industry and generated additional revenue through tourist visits, because you never forget that dimension that people are often interested to go and see where the food they're eating is coming from. So the creation of the opportunity for hotel guests and resort guests to visit the farms and the farmyards was an important part of the total package. So they managed to bring 41 customers on board, including 15 hotels, 3 5-star hotels, and 12 4-star. So they were able to bring them in as purchasers of the market produce from the subsistence farmers. You see the growth in sales volumes in terms of tons between 2004 and 2007. The impact on rural livelihoods was dramatic. For Gambia's good producers, their average rise in incomes was 500%. You can see what it says around the new well there. Hard work is to achieve and success. So Gambia is Good was finally closed down when the president regarded it as too much competition, and Gambia is Good was closed down by government action. What is fundamental, I hope you've realised from these two examples so far, is to measure the impacts on the triple bottom lines. Economic responsibility. Is the income to communities good, and is it value for money for the purchasers? We need to think about the socio-cultural responsibility. Is what's being done culturally sensitive? And we need to think about environmental responsibility. Are we enhancing or destroying the natural environment by what we do? You cannot just ignore those other dimensions of responsible tourism and sustainability when we think about creating shared value. So GIG's impact over the effectively 4 years of its operation worked with over 1,000 Gambian producers, indirectly benefiting 5,000 people, 90% of whom were women. GIG enabled farmers to move from subsistence to commercial farming. They were successful SMMEs. And about 98,000 GB pounds went directly into the hands of poor Gambian farmers for the purchase of over 210 tonnes of produce. It also reduced imports and increased the consumption of locally grown produce, with benefits to local farmers and obvious benefits to the environment in terms of reduced carbon emissions from transporting vegetables into the Gambia. Now, this idea was taken up in India through the RTD2, which took place in Kerala in India in 2008. Adam Abbar from GIG was there in 2008 and talked about Gambia is good. Rupesh Kumar took the idea up in India in two different ways: experiential tour packages, which are sold as village life experiences, and you can see there women engaged in learning to make coir rope. I have a piece of coir rope that I made in a village just like that. It sits on the windowsill in my bedroom. There are examples of people harvesting coconuts to make toddy, and people working with other kinds of rural crafts there. Very important principle that these are commissionable products where the tour operator or hotel who sells this to their guests get a commission on those sales, which is obviously the way the mainstream industry works. So that's important in integrating the SMMEs into the tourism value chain. So responsible tourism in Kenya took off with experiments in 4 different villages, 4 different experiments, 4 different villages. It worked in only one, worked in Kumarakoram. The man up on the top right there is Rupesh Kumar, who led that initiative in the backwaters of a village in Kumarakoram. And he did 2 things. He created the village life experiences, and modelling himself on what Adama had done with Gambia is Good, they created producer goods to provide fruit and vegetables, particularly to the hotels. Having proven it in an experiment, it was rolled out from 2010 to 2017 with RT units, responsible tourism units, for production, procurement and supply, and really demonstrated the success. You can see here the situation up to 2017 and then what happened after 2017 in a mere 2 years, when the state government decided to roll this out across the whole of Kerala. There's 2 things I think worthy of particular note here. One is obviously the sheer scale of the success. I don't need to go through the figures to demonstrate that. But equally important was the understanding that the way you found out what worked was to experiment. And they had 4 different experiments, but only one of them worked. And it was the one that worked that they replicated and rolled out across the state through a newly formed responsible tourism mission, which is led by Rupesh Kumar, who now has an enormous amount of practical experience of making these things. The owners of the factory decided to create an opportunity for local crafters and food sellers to sell to the people who were stopping the coach loads and the individuals travelling in private cars, to give them an opportunity to sell to the very same tourists. So it did nothing to undermine their attraction, the glass blowing factory, but it did everything to create opportunities, create shared value for local community crafters. Really successful example. They were winners in the Global Responsible Tourism Awards in 2023. Now to a Tanzanian coffee farm, which is probably the project I most wish that I had been involved with, but I wasn't. I was asked to evaluate the project on behalf of the Dutch Development Agency. Tanzanian coffee farm. The man who did this, Hans Bockholt, was very brave. He didn't start to work with the community until 2 weeks before the first tour group were to arrive. Having flown overnight from Europe, tourists were taken to a coffee farm. It was split into groups of 3 or 4 who went off to be told about the particular coffee farmer's farm, who talked through with them each of the plants and the strengths and weaknesses and the problems that they'd had in securing coffee production from them. Very intense experience of coffee growing. They would then pick a few beans, bring them back to the main centre where they would be turned into, where the beans would be ground. Now, when I took that photograph, they weren't necessarily talking about coffee, they were talking about the education of their children. And what had happened was that very quickly, that group of tourists had got used to themselves as a group who'd never met before until they got off the plane in Tanzania, but also had begun to appreciate what they could get by talking to local people about their experience of life. Much enriched the experience for the tourists as well as enriching the lives of the coffee farmers. So the cost benefit is that from a community perspective, for a very small investment in training and the use of communal land, a third of the costs were earned back in the first 6 months of that operation, and it's produced sustainable livelihoods for the farmers. An important part of this, though, was making sure that no coffee farmer became dependent on the revenues from tourism. This was an additional, not an alternative livelihood. So the principle of avoiding dependency on tourism and treating tourism as an additional livelihood rather than the main livelihood was achieved with this project, and you can read about that in the case study which we wrote up and published in Coffee Culture, Destinations and Tourism in 2010, a long time ago now. Then we did a project with IIED, the International Institute for Environment and Development, which was funded by the Darwin Initiative. This was around Bwindi Impenetrable National Park in Uganda. And the challenge was to find ways in which the local community who had been excluded when the park was gazetted could earn from tourism. And what we recognised was if we could delay the tourists for an extra night, then it made the value of those tourists greater, both for the tour operators and the accommodation providers. But more importantly, from our point of view, it increased the local and retained revenue from tourism expenditures in the local community, thereby creating a positive economic impact and livelihood change, reducing poverty, improving local people's attitudes to conservation, and reducing the threats to the forest biodiversity, where the gorillas are the icon species. We need to see a lot more of these kinds of projects around the world. It's been written up by IIED. You can find a copy of that online. The primary thing that really worked here was the production of local food, but in terms of just sheer cash value, the baskets. Now, the way the baskets were improved was by employing a local artist from Kampala and paying him to train the local women to make these much higher quality baskets than they've been used to making. And the baskets were sold as 100% forest friendly. You can see they are very attractive, very distinctive, very much from that area and very much reflecting the landscape colours of that part of Uganda around the impenetrable forest. They are simply both beautiful to look at and evidently beautifully made. And that's really, I think, what's special about these. They are remarkable baskets. You can see we knew they needed to be displayed, but that was easily done. You just make some local display cases for the hotels. The picture on the right is of a same initiative but different project within the initiative. This was poachers turned market gardeners with their own village nature trail that we worked with them to develop, and that gave a livelihood to people who had previously been making a living by poaching in the national park. But this is really the pièce de résistance, I think, of the whole thing. Kwetu Africa is the Ugandan artist's training name, Sananda Gateja, and he upcycles all kinds of plastic and paper beads into wearable art pieces. But he's the person who worked with the women on their baskets. But here's the rub. This is an email that my colleague Peter, who did most of the work on this project. I was only there for the start off, setting it up. Hi Peter, sorry to ask this, but kindly help me with some kind of advice. We're selling the new basket at $10, but due to the high demand from clients, we want to sell them at $20. To which Peter replied, sell them for as much as you can get. And the incomes of those women, it took a bit longer to produce a basket of that quality, but their incomes dramatically improved from the activity. Now, I wanted to remind us all of the tsunami of the 26th of December 2004. You could see the damage that the tsunami did to everything around the hotels. 226,000 people killed. A terrible tragedy. But one thing, when you get over looking at the devastation, one thing that strikes you is the hotels are still there, but everything around the hotels is not. The hotels were insured and were quite quickly back up and functioning. But a big part of why people go to visit those hotels is the community activities that went on around the hotels. And they took a lot longer to re-establish. I think what the tsunami demonstrated to those of us in tourism development was the very obvious point, but one that's easy to forget, which is that most of the tourism activity in most cases takes place outside the hotels. And you can insure the hotels, but you can't insure and guarantee the continuation of the activity, the community activity around the hotels, which is a big part of what attracts the tourists. And for me, certainly, that 2004 tsunami made me recognise just how important the SMME activity around the hotels and in the community is to the functioning of tourism. So, what can you do to maximize the positives and minimize the negatives of creating shared value. I think basically, if you're a business, you need to think about how you purchase more in a local supply chain and how you support the development of that local supply chain. You need to think about minimizing waste and maximizing the upcycling of plastic waste, for example. You need to think about conserving and promoting natural and cultural heritage and providing guided experiences, because that's what people are coming for. They're not coming to stay in your hotel bedroom. They're coming to the hotel because they want to access what's going on outside of the hotel. Ask yourself what's good for you and at the same time good for your neighbours. You need to work with others. Choice editing, destination by destination, is critical. If you're working to provide potable water not out of plastic bottles, you're reducing the amount of plastic water bottles imported into the area. You're using local water which you purified in one way or another, creating a shared value, saving on the carbon involved in shipping water around, and removing plastic waste from the environment by not bringing it into the environment in the first place. You need to think about working with communities to increase their benefits and engage with ministries and local councils to make them understand why this is important, and that enriching the local community also enriches the tourist experience, improving the reputation of the destination and attracting more tourists in a sustainable way. Finally, I just wanted to draw your attention to a new website, Technology for Responsible Tourism, where you can find information about alternative green technologies that can be used in travel and tourism. And to remind you that the World Responsible Tourism Award categories this year in 2024 are making travel inclusive, championing cultural diversity, being nature positive, telling us what you're doing about climate change, increasing local sourcing and creating shared value, and employing and upskilling local communities. The Africa Awards are already open. They close on March the 1st. And there are the resources, most of them, where there's a blue link available online, most of them available if you go to haroldgoodwin.info and look at the publications page. Thank you for listening. I hope that this will have encouraged you to develop your work on creating shared value. There are massive opportunities which are very beneficial both to businesses and communities, and because they're beneficial to communities, beneficial to local and national governments. Thank you for listening.